and hopefully end by 8:15 at the latest. Our liturgy, which could be defined as the established script of Jewish worship. The script itself, those what are considered to be required elements of the service in Hebrew are called matbea tefillah. The matbea tefillah poses occasionally challenges to contemporary sensibility, even as it continues to retain the prayers in the Siddur, its hallowed status, often its literary complexity and beauty.
Mute.
On the one hand, whoops. Everybody on mute here? Yes. On the one hand, the liturgy's often hierarchical, particularistic, gendered language reinforces assumptions that can be offensive to some Jews or to others who come to our services. Its references to ancient priestly rituals can feel irrelevant, overly detailed. On the other hand, because there always is one, jettisoning parts of our inherited tradition would deprive us of a critical link to our Jewish past and to other Jews around the world, even if any halachic concerns about how to change prayers are sufficiently addressed. Can we pray what we don't believe to be true? Can we pray what we don't believe to be true? Should we, in pursuit of intellectual honesty, eliminate or revise outmoded prayers? For anyone that studied the Siddur or prayer in general, most likely you know that liturgical change has existed for as long as the liturgy itself has existed. But debates about whether to remove or replace or reinterpret prayers took on particular energy in the modern period as we as Jews confronted important trends in our broader society, such as democracy and citizenship, nationalism and universalism, and of course, changing views on gender and sexuality. This evening's title, Do We Need to Mean What We Pray? Sacrifices in the Prayer, focuses on one of the great concerns of many of the Siddurim from the 19th and 20th century, many that we will be familiar with, whether to remove or reframe references to the sacrifices. There are many for whom sacrifices were part of Judaism's ancient past, irrelevant to contemporary Jewish life, and as such, the call for their restoration in our Shabbat Musaf service did not ring true. We're going to study towards the very end, examples from how different denominations responded to the challenges posed by sacrificial language in prayer, and illustrate a variety of ideas about how language itself functions. We do that probably as a good example because although there are many beautiful sections of the Birkot HaShachar and Psukei de Zimra that did not become a part of formal prayer and davening till pretty late, even though their words were developed earlier on in the Talmud. In contemporary world today, given when people arrive in synagogue, the main exposure to prayer outside of the Torah service comes via the Musaf service. So the issues that are raised by sacrifices remain pressing for us today, or should, in our own quest for a meaningful prayer experience. We know that many of us who participate in communal prayer are content to recite the words without necessarily interrogating the meaning. And there are others who have given up on prayer because they don't believe what those prayers affirm. What shape should Jewish prayer take today and tomorrow? And how important is it for the words of the Siddur to match our own personal beliefs? One more question: what are the benefits and what are the costs of liturgical change? So before we get to the video, I want to ask you a question, and if there are individuals that are comfortable in sharing, then please do so. It's not a discussion, it's just a bit of sharing. I'd like to know, what is your general attitude towards prayer? What do you find meaningful when you think of prayer? Or is there something that you find particularly challenging? Anyone?
I think
I do.
I think prayer really helps me. It really helps me to, if I'm worried about something, and it's like talking to God, like Friday night, or it really does a lot to me.
Okay, thank you.
Michael?
I'm
sorry.
Oh, Henry, sorry.
It's I feel comfortable if I can relate to what I'm reading. And if the prayer and I cannot relate to each other, then I don't say it. I just skip it. As an example, the second paragraph in the Shema. I cannot relate to that. When it says, if you do this, God will make it rain. If you don't do this, God will not make it rain. I just don't believe that happened. I think that puts God too much into the personal picture, because then we can see God in a negative way. If you look at what happens to people, like innocent people, young people who suffer, then we say, if God is so involved in our lives, why does he allow the innocent to suffer? And therefore, God is not such a good being. So I'd rather eliminate things that I cannot relate to, and then I don't have some negative feelings.
Okay. So part of what this class and what you're going to hear is about, do we eliminate them from the prayer book itself, which is what some denominations and movements and others, or eliminate the service? Do we keep it in because of its value of where it comes? Do we reframe it in many ways, as that second paragraph of the Shema? Arthur Waskow has done a great book on reframing that middle paragraph of the Shema. And if we weren't talking about Musaf, the Shema would be a good example of, we have Shman, Be'ahavta, and Tzitzit, and we have that middle paragraph. Okay, anybody else want to share? Elisa.
So I would say for me, the aspects of prayer that focus on self-reflection, or that drive self-reflection and drive sort of make me realize how much gratitude I have for various things. Those are the aspects of prayer that speak to me.
Okay, thank you. And of course, the word for praying is, as many of you know, lehit palel, which is a reflexive verb meaning to judge myself, right? Things that cause us to think about ourselves. Mark, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say pretty much the same things that everybody's already said. For me, prayer is a way for me to communicate directly with God. But in addition to that, and I hope it's not sacrilege, but I consider prayer to be a form of meditation. And similar to what Elisa just said, it's an opportunity to sort out your thoughts and figure out how they all fit in to the bigger picture. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I said to Mark and Amy at one point that there are people who study meditation and calmness, and when they do brain studies, they find that that when you daven and sometimes don't know what the words mean, you get into the mantra of davening and the melody and the prayer, and you allow the thoughts that might be coming in and external stimuli, but you come back to the prayer and the mantra of davening, that has great health benefits in and of itself, even if you don't understand the words of the prayer. Okay, so let's go to the video, as they say. And we thank Becca for running our video and text for tonight. And then we'll come back and we'll study a few texts as a background, and then the actual examples from a few Sidurim of the Musaf service. That looks nice, but doesn't look like Musaf.
Can you see the video or no?
No, we see there you go. Now we
Okay. Need to make sure I can share the sound. I don't know where my toolbar went. Sorry, guys. I had it and then it disappeared. There we go.
Now we're back at the picture of a beach.
Okay, let me move where I have video. I'm working off of two monitors, so sorry about this. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry.
I don't even try.
You up there.
Right now, we don't see anything else.
No, and it keeps
Okay.
going to a different video, which is what worries me a little bit. Okay. I had it all set up. I apologize. Let me skip ahead so we don't get the in.
Becca, you're not sharing the screen.
I know.
Hey, just making sure.
Skipping ahead to this part. Now let's share screen. There we go. Now everything is in one place and I can more see what I'm doing. Don't let me share sound though. There we go. Share sound.
What do Jews believe? This simple question has never had a simple answer, but one productive approach is to ask another question. What do Jews say when they pray? Judaism does not have a catechism, a single statement of its core beliefs, but the prayer book, or Siddur, has been the most important influence and reflection of what Jews apparently believe. This was true in antiquity, when our liturgy, the text of Jewish prayer, started to take shape. It remained true in the medieval period, when the first full prayer books were compiled. And it is especially true in the modern era, when Siddur editions have proliferated, reflecting the diverse ethnicities and ideologies of Jews around the world. Jewish law places certain limits on the text of traditional prayer, and yet there have always been pressure valves to allow for flexibility and creativity. For example, there's a long tradition of supplemental poetry, or piyut. There are prayer book commentaries, illuminations, and of course music. These artistic and scholarly ornamentations add texture to Jewish prayer, but still do not clarify the question of belief. Each geographic area and historical period has seen Jews adapting prayer so that ancient forms could continue to inspire communities to connect with the divine. Often this process is quite organic, escaping notice and avoiding controversy. But some modifications of the prayer book stand in for momentous shifts in belief, leading to debates, and in some extreme cases, even to excommunication and book burnings. Over the past 2 centuries, Siddurim have mirrored the Jewish encounter with broader social themes such as democracy and citizenship, rationalism and mysticism, gender and sexuality, Zionism and universalism. In the colonial period, American Sidurim adapted the traditional prayer for our country, which had asked God to show mercy to the king, to the new democratic context of government by the people. In the mid-20th century, the rationalist Mordecai Kaplan stripped his Siddur of supernaturalism, messianism, prayers for the restoration of sacrifice, and even the assertion of Jewish chosenness. Conservative Siddurim didn't go nearly as far, but they too addressed each of these concerns with subtle edits and artful translations. In this session, we are going to focus on one great concern of 20th century Siddurim, the removal or reframing of references to the sacrifices in our prayer. Ever since the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, Jews have prayed for its rebuilding and for the reinstitution of the cult, with its emphasis on sacrifices of animals and grains upon the altar. As the centuries passed and the temple remained unbuilt, Jews related to this core part of our ancient ritual in a variety of ways. Sages engaged in halachic debate about the fine details of the sacrifices, which became an academic activity made more challenging by its purely theoretical nature. Liturgists patterned our daily Shabbat and festival prayers on the schedule of the old sacrifices, integrating references to them into various prayers, especially the Musaf service. Mystics reconceived of the sacrifices in spiritual terms, with each sacrifice symbolizing a different contemplative mode of approaching the divine. Musicians composed rousing melodies for Musaf and other annual highlights, such as the Avodah service on Yom Kippur, adding a sense of drama to the synagogue service. Nevertheless, for many Jews, the sacrifice became part of a gauzy, mythological background to Judaism, rather than a serious model for contemporary prayer. They simply didn't reflect modern Jewish belief. By the 19th century, early Jewish reformers targeted the sacrifices as not merely irrelevant, but offensive to their ideals of Jewish worship. Just as Protestant Christians criticized Roman Catholic rituals as superstitious and lacking moral seriousness, so did Jewish reformers attack continued references to the sacrificial system as a distraction from the higher ethical purposes that they most valued in Judaism. A second objection to the sacrifices was that they assumed the rebuilding of a Jerusalem temple and a return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. But the reformers embraced citizenship in the countries where they resided and rejected the idea that they were in exile, whether in Germany or France or America. And so they cut the sacrifices out of the Siddur. By the late 19th century, a constellation of rabbis, scholars, and business leaders who objected to radical reform organized to create a more traditional seminary, which became JTS, and eventually led to the creation of a third movement, Conservative Judaism. They agreed with some of the ideas of the reformers, but insisted on more modest and nuanced edits that would maintain continuity with the ancient liturgy, even while connecting it to contemporary concerns. As you will see, scholars of the conservative movement rejected the changes made by Mordecai Kaplan, who simply deleted all passages that offended him. Kaplan's Siddur really offended the Orthodox Agudath Rabbanim. Even as war raged in Europe, they gathered in New York City in 1945 to excommunicate Kaplan and burn his Siddur. In contrast, liturgists of the conservative movement made modest changes in the Hebrew text and took more liberties with the English translation. Even these changes were too much for some of our rabbis, such as Ben Sion Boxer, who complained about the literalism of his colleagues. He argued for understanding our prayers as metaphor and poetry, rather than as literal descriptions of modern Jewish belief. Nevertheless, Siddurim of the conservative movement in America and in Israel have continued this pattern of making only minimal changes in the Hebrew and using translation, commentary, and alternatives to reflect more far-reaching changes in Jewish belief. In this session, I encourage you to look closely at the excerpts from our Sidurim. What has been changed and what has been left behind? When you pray, how important is it for the words to match your personal beliefs? Have these updated Sidurim been an accurate reflection of what Jews believe or want to believe? What has been sacrificed on the altar of modernity, and what shape should Jewish prayer take today and tomorrow?
That's a tall order for us to actually accomplish in a short amount of time. So Becca, let's put up the first text. We're going to study a series of texts that take us through the various movements and their thinking about prayer in general, especially prayers around the Musaf and sacrificial system. The very first one that we'll be reading here comes from the Pittsburgh platform. Many people I know, if you've studied conservative Judaism or you've attended synagogue, as most of you have, know that there was the very famous Treifa banquet that basically broke up the idea of one non-Orthodox movement in America. The Treifa banquet occurred in July of 1883, and then it was 2 years later that the leaders of American Reform Judaism passed this Pittsburgh platform as an opportunity to set guidelines of religious life. No longer, for example, viewing the rabbinic tradition as being of divine origin, and anything that would stand in the way of modern civilization could be modified. In the wake, in particular, of the transformation of Jews, which was what we were used to for so many hundreds, if not thousands of years, from being a subject to somebody to a citizen, also the attempt to remove nationalism, a national element in Judaism. Article 5 is really the one that's relevant to liturgical change, but let's read through. Do we have a volunteer that wants to read, beginning with Article 2? Oh, Elisa. Okay. Well, first Elisa volunteered first, then David, you'll read the next one.
Fine.
I didn't think I volunteered, but I'll be glad to read.
You have a hand up on your screen. So.
I do? Oh, that's interesting. All right,
So-
well, I'll read.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and read Article 2. We recognize in the Bible the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission as the priest of the one God, and value it as the most potent instrument of religious and moral instruction. We hold that the modern discoveries of scientific researches in the domain of nature and history are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism, the Bible reflecting the primitive ideas of its own age, and at times clothing its conception of divine providence and justice, dealing with men in miraculous narratives.
Okay, so their view of the Bible, continue on.
Article 3, we recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine, and today we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization.
Okay. What's interesting, by the way, about that is that, clearly Israel had a different conception, that nationalism was diminished. And yet at the same time, the Reform movement has truly evolved in its strong support of Israel. And they were really the first movement to come forward in support of Israel before major Orthodox and even the conservative movement in 1948. All right, David, you want to read Articles 4 and 5?
Sure. Article 4, we hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws are regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They failed to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct that extract than to further modern spiritual elevation.
Wow,
Article-
that's quite a statement. Just gives you an idea of where the space was of the Reform movement versus today, because all of those Mosaic laws, kashrut and dress, which meant kippah and talit and everything, are foreign and actually interfere with spiritual elevation. Okay, so the fifth one, I want you to just think about what they thought about sacrifice in Israel and everything based on this and a restoration of Israel. Go ahead.
Article 5, we recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect, the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state.
Okay, thank you. So
No more Kohanim.
Right. So what are the principles implied in their reasoning? Anybody?
It's inconsistent with modern life and modern thought and modern men and people. And they go so far as to say, well, they made some statement about cave age in Article 2 and 3.
Okay.
So rather a strong statement, but they got a point.
Anyone else? Right. It was a different kind of, and the messianism was that of a universal culture of heart and intellect, right? And close to being realized, right? In some senses, close to be realized in the modern age, but completely divorced from any return to the land of Israel. So, ultimately, if a return to Zion and a restoration of the temple was no longer to be expected with a universal messianism of us in the world, then the Siddur, in essence, had to be reformed accordingly. Okay, so let's go to the second one. This was the introduction written by Mordechai Kaplan and Rabbi Eugene Cohn in 1945. Basically, you'll see that both Rabbis Kaplan and Cohn struck prayers, took them out, that they considered problematic, like Musaf. But their reasoning will be different than the Reform movement. To make it easier to understand, Kaplan thought that prayer wasn't working for most modern Jews because what people said and what people believed needed to fit together. That was part of the Reconstructionist movement. What people said and what they believed needed to fit closely together. Mel Skolt in the 90s wrote a book about Mordechai Kaplan. And he wrote that Mordechai Kaplan's goal was simple: to bring the liturgy more in line with what he thought Jews actually believed. Kaplan encouraged a movement from prayer as quotation, meaning reciting prayers that may have at one time been meaningful but were no longer, to rather prayer as affirmation, where we need to strongly believe what we actually say. And we heard how the Orthodox felt about that because they ended up burning his books. So someone want to read that text. As we're reading it, I want you to think about the approach. What actually do they think about the approach of leaving traditional prayers unchanged and reinterpreting them rather than amending the Siddur, and why they think that? So somebody like to read?
I'll read.
Okay, Mona, please.
In order to retain the continuity of Judaism and at the same time to satisfy the spiritual demands of our day, it is necessary to make changes in the content of the prayer book. To preserve the authority of Jewish tradition, it is necessary to retain the classical framework of the service and to adhere to the fundamental teachings of that tradition concerning God, man, and the world. However, ideas or beliefs in conflict with what we have come to be regarded as true or right should be eliminated. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah,
Oh.
we can read. I'm going to stop you after the end
Okay.
of the two sentences, but go
Some
ahead.
have attempted to obviate the need for change in the traditional prayers by reading into them meaning completely at variance with what they meant to those who framed them. This practice is fraught with danger. To read those new meanings into the traditional text by way of translation is to violate the principle of forthrightness.
So I want to stop you there and look at that. I found that amazing because if we look into contemporary American society, what does it sound like? That you can't look into the traditional prayers and read them at variance that might mean something different than those who framed them, right? It violates the principle. What does that sound like?
Conservative constitutionalists.
Yeah, originalists, exactly.
Originalists.
It sounds like the debate that's been going on about the Supreme Court. And this is from the person that taught at JTS, but created Reconstructionism. The idea that you cannot read into, it's just too difficult to read into is their first point. I just find it very interesting coming from who Kaplan was, that we can look at it and see it from a different context. Okay, continue.
Rabbi, just quickly,
Yes.
isn't he also saying, I see him saying here that translating into English what's different than what the Hebrew text is saying is a violation of the principle of forthrightness. And perhaps he saw that in the conservative movement, and that's what he's objecting to.
I think he's objecting overall. I don't think he was relating it to the conservative movement in this case, because in very little writings did he do that. He was expressing his opinion in a different way. But you can interpret the first part of what you said easily by what's here, right? If you read into them meanings, he doesn't say you interpret different meanings. He said if you read into them, but you're right. He means if you write them out of existence, then you can't say that they were part of the framers. And that's still the argument that we have in constitutional arguments in constitutional law. You change the law so radically that you take out of oblivion the original meaning of what was there. Okay, but that's really not what his main thing is. So continue, Mona.
Okay, to assume that the average worshiper will arrive at them of his own accord is to expect the unattainable. Our prayers must meet the needs of simple and literal-minded people, even of the young and immature. We dare not take the chance of conveying meanings which do not conform with the best in our religious thinking and feeling. Not the prayers need to be prosaic in their literalness, but their figures of speech must have clear and true meanings. People expect the Jewish prayer book to express what a Jew should believe about God, Israel, and the Torah, and about the meaning of human life and the destiny of mankind. We must not disappoint them in that expectation. But unless we eliminate from the traditional text statements of beliefs that are untenable and of desires which we do not or should not cherish, we mislead the simple and alienate the sophisticated. The simple will accept the false with the true, to the detriment of their spiritual growth. The sophisticated will feel that a Jewish service has little value for people of modern mentality. Rather than leaving such questionable passages to reinterpretation, we should omit or revise them.
So, I will say again, come back, David, to what you said, that since we're going to be talking about a little bit later on and about the Shabbat and Festival prayer book, that did do a lot of reinterpretation, just so I remember to say it. That year was 1946, and this was from 1945. Now, that doesn't mean that it wasn't close enough that those ideas were being floated around. What do you think of that? What do you think of that paragraph? Right? Why does he think? Why does he think? Nowadays, we'd say the language would not exactly be received in a positive way, for sure, from the way he was able to write it. But he clearly is not for reinterpretation. He would rather just remove those prayers that aren't able to reach the average person coming to synagogue. Any reactions?
Yeah, I think the one sentence really summarizes it well. The sophisticated will feel that a Jewish service has little value for people of modern mentality.
Well, that's what he feels.
Yeah,
that if you leave in things like sacrifice and the Musaf service, he's not necessarily talking just about that. This is a general introduction to the prayer, right? Look, there's one sentence in here that we would all say, wow, don't we, is he not right about this, right? People expect a Jewish prayer book to express what a Jew should believe about God, Israel, and the Torah, and about the meaning of human life and the destiny of mankind. It's a beautiful sentence. Who could object to it? Okay, Howard.
I think I sort of, Trudy does, I don't need to believe everything that's in the prayer book, and I'm comfortable with any liturgy that doesn't assume that the Messiah has already come. So I don't think it's something everybody.
Right. And that's the debate, right, over prayer. Can we continue to say those things? Michael, did you have something to say?
When I look at this, it seems to me it's terribly Jewish. It indicates, just like in the tractate Pesachim, there are different levels of understanding and different levels of comprehension and different levels of meaning. We go back to Peshat, and he's very, very simple in what, there's the simple man in here, sophisticated man, there's the modern man. And he's responding to what he thinks all of us should do.
Right. Or if we connect it to the Haggadah, right, to the four different children.
Well, if Haggadah comes from Tractate Pesachim, where they talk about 3 or 4 different types of pedagogy.
Right. Okay, so let's.
There's one other thing that was going on, Rabbi. At this time of time, there was a guy by the name of Morris Weitz, who was a very famous philosopher who wrote an essay that was called The Intentional Fallacy, that when you look at a writing that's special, like a prayer book or ancient text, don't infer into it, read out of it, was his idea. And Kaplan is very much saying, read out of it, don't read into it.
Well, Kaplan is saying eliminate it.
Not quite.
Yeah, but that's what he did practically.
Kaplan was true to his word. He eliminated the Musaf service. There is no Musaf Amida in the Reconstructionist synagogue. So he said what he meant, and he meant what he said.
Art Green, no, I don't want to get into that. All right.
All right. Well, it's true. There is no.
I believe this is from Judaism as a Civilization, which was a rebundal to Freud. It's absolutely done, and it's absolute decimation of Freud's analysis of the human condition.
Right. Great book. Okay. So we're gonna skip over the next one because of timing with Mordechai Kaplan and Eugene Cohn. Again, it just is a comparison between the Reform movement and the Reconstructionist movement. We're going to go to number 4 with Robert Gordos from 1946. If you want to contrast Kaplan's Siddur, our Siddur that we Robert Gordis's Shabbat and Festival prayer book, which was the Silverman. We called it the Silverman Siddur. which was published a year later, really only made minor edits in the Hebrew, and instead, as you'll see, used interpretive translations in order to update the ideology of the Siddur. And I guess when we look at this excerpt, it's an example of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who used to say, "V'hayashan yitchadesh, v'hachadash yitkadesh." It's a wonderful play on words. Basically, that means let the old be renewed and the new be sanctified. Let the old be renewed and the new be sanctified. And of course, he was the first chief rabbi of Israel, so he wasn't necessarily talking about liturgy, but the idea of renewing something of old and learning to sanctify that. And as we heard, with different opinions, there are strengths and weaknesses to this approach. So, who would like to read?
I'm happy to do it.
Okay, go ahead.
There will naturally be instances, however, where reinterpretation is impossible and the traditional formulation cannot be made to serve our modern outlook.
Skip down, because they're giving examples that are not in ours. So skip down to the 5th line in the middle, the deletion of Musaf.
The deletion of Musaf service as a whole, however, would mean destroying the entire structure of the traditional liturgy, besides eliminating several valuable ideas and aspirations from the prayer book. Primarily, the Musaf service voices our hope for the restoration of Palestine as the homeland of the Jewish people. But that is not all. Also implied in the prayer is the recognition that sacrifice is essential for the fulfillment of all human ideals. Then too, we cherish the hope that Palestine will again become significant, not only for Israel, but for the spiritual life of mankind as a whole. Finally, it is characteristic of Judaism to recall the sacrifice system, which represents a legitimate stage in the evolution of Judaism and religion generally. As Israel Abrahams wrote, "This is the virtue of a historical religion, that the traces of history are never obliterated. The lower did not perish in the birth of the higher, but persisted." It's as much as I can say.
Okay, well, let's end it there. At the very end, he talks about the fact of what exactly they did. They maintained certain of the prayers, and we'll be studying them, so we don't have to do that. But they also said they decided to add a bakasha, sort of a kavanah or meditation before, to put it in context, right? In essence, what they were doing in Silverman's Siddur was to put in what we talked about last week, the motto of tradition and change. They kept the tradition of the Musaf. They kept much of the language, as you'll see in the Musaf, but they decided to surround it by a meditation and to reinterpret it in keeping it for its historical value. Okay, so the last one was actually from Ben Sion Boxer, who wrote the introduction to a High Holiday prayer book, and this was in 1959, and it was actually an introduction asking the question about whether to eliminate the sacrifices from the Umibnei Chatainu Galinu Me'artzenu, the section, because of our sins we were exiled from the land, and eliminate the korbanot. So let's at least do the first paragraph of that. That's number 5. Someone want to read that first paragraph? Anybody?
I'll do it if you don't have any other volunteers.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. We are resolved to treat the term korbanot as we have come to treat the term avodah. The latter was originally a technical term referring to the cult of animal sacrifices in the temple. It was later extended to any form of divine service, including prayer. Korban invites a similar treatment. Literally, it means that which is brought before God. Originally, it referred to the animal sacrificed, but the animal sacrifice was only a particularization of a more general objective, to express devotion to God. The korban, in other words, was, in its essential character, a token of devotion to God. In a metaphoric sense, this term is applicable to any other act expressing our devotion to God.
Okay, so there you go, right? The solution is, it's not so surprising to reinterpret something. We all grew up maybe, or we had children that were raising to al shlosha hadvarim, al shlosha devarim, al shlosha, right? Al haTorah ve'al avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. What did avodah mean there? It meant sacrifices. Only later on was avodah elevated and reinterpreted from being sacrifices to avodat halev, to sacrifices of the heart. So why should we not reinterpret what korban means, what korbanot means, becoming closer to God? Okay, so we are going to, in the remaining half hour, see a few examples of, and you can show those examples. So go down to what essentially it says, source 6. No, keep going. Yes, that's where we want that page. Perfect. Okay. Difficult to see, I'm sure, not as easy. We're going to look at 3 Sidurim, thank you, which is all about the very beginning after the Kedusha, the prayer that's normally said in the Musaf service. It's in bold, it's known as Tikanta Shabbat. It's found nowadays in every Ashkenazic Sidur in one way or another. It's not an ancient prayer. The sacrifices are ancient that are referred to inside, but Tikanta Shabbat actually originated in the medieval period. And it is, as you will see, a piyut. It's a creative poem, a piyut, like many of our prayers, asking for God to return us to Eretz Yisrael and to restore the sacrifices in the temple. So we're going to see different ones and maybe think about the strengths and weaknesses of each of the approaches. So if we look at Tikanta Shabbat Ratzita Karbonoteha, you'll at least look and see in the Hebrew. Look at the first letter of each word of the top sentence. Tikanta Shabbat Ratzita Korbonoteha Tzivita Perusha Im Sidurei Nisacheha. Do you notice anything about that? First letter of each word.
It's reverse alphabetical.
Right, it's a reverse acrostic. Many piyutim, as we know, many of the piyutim that we encounter on the high holidays and in other places, including the Ashrei, with some exceptions. Ashrei, right, all the way through is an acrostic. This is a reverse acrostic from Taf to Aleph. And let's just, I'm gonna read it quickly in English because I think it's probably difficult to read. I have to take off my glasses to read most of this. Tikanta Shabbat, you established the Sabbath, found favor in its offerings, instructors regarded its commentaries along with the order of its showbreads, the 12 loaves of challah. Those who delight in it will inherit eternal honor. Those who savor it will merit life. Those who love the speech that befits it have chosen greatness. This is Shabbat. Then from Sinai, they were instructed about it when you commanded us, Hashem, our God, to offer it on the Shabbat Musaf offering properly. May it be your will, Hashem, our God and God of our forefathers, you bring us up in gladness to our land, plant us in our boundaries, will perform before you the rite of our required Musaf offerings, the continual offerings in their order, the Musaf ones according to their laws, and the Musaf of the Sabbath day will perform and offer to you with love, according to the commandment to your will, as you've written to us in your Torah through Moses, your servant, from your glorious expression, as it is said. Okay. So here we have a very literal, right, return to sacrifice in the temple, right? I'm sure many of us have been to grand, very emotional, joyous celebrations where yeshiva bachers and people of all ages in the traditional go around in the circle and they sing Yibane, Yibane, Yibane hat mikdash, Yirtzion, Yirtzion, Yirtzion temale. That's all about the prayer at the end of a traditional musaf that says, Yehi ratzon mefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Avotenu, you know, that we should return to the rebuilding of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem, and to the sacrifices. That is, in essence, what the traditional musaf is all about. And then it quotes from the Torah about the different points of the musaf service. So let's go to the next one, right? The next one is the Siddur from Silverman. So there were a few changes to what you see in the second paragraph, still an acrostic, but a few grammatical changes, verb changes, but by and large, they kept the text of the Musaf, Tekanta Shabbat Ratzita Korbenoteha. They kept it accurate, but they added, as we read in that introduction, they added what says in the right, a bakasha or a kavanah, a meditation, something that we hope. They added that meditation. Someone want to read that for us? Anybody? Can you see it? All right, I'll read it. Our God and God of our fathers, may there come before thee the remembrance of our ancestors as they appeared in thy sacred temple in the days of yore. How deep was their love of thee as they brought thee their offerings each Shabbat day. We pray thee, grant us of the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord that lived in their hearts. May we, in their spirit of sacrificial devotion, fulfill our duty towards the rebuilding of thy holy land, the fountain of our life, that we may ever be a blessing to all peoples on earth. This is before the establishment of Eretz Yisrael. What did they do here?
They tried to provide a context for the Tikkun, for the next prayer.
Okay, well, go ahead.
But what I find very interesting, though, in the meditation, they mention the word sacrifice. In the Orthodox translation, they chose to translate korban as offering, which is not an incorrect interpretation, but they could just as well have called it sacrifice, and they called it offering, which a sacrifice is, of course. But I just find that interesting that here
if you have the text at home, you can read the commentary at the bottom. I didn't have the time to do it, where they actually bring in a Kabbalistic understanding as well, a mystical understanding, which we don't have to cover here. But what it does show you is that even in the Orthodox Siddur, which is a more recent Siddur, they felt the need to use, they could have used the word sacrifice, but offerings is it has a dual meaning, right? It can mean both, of course, the offerings of the temple, but it can also mean the offerings of the heart. So it's always fascinating to see. Here, sacrifice becomes sacrificial devotion. Okay, so now we're going to go to our Lev Shalem. There we go. Now, this is, as you know, in our Musaf service that we daven every Shabbat, we have two versions. We have the original version that's there, and then we have what's called the alternative vision, which will be on the next page. The language, no, but let's go back to the original up there, right? the language that's in the Hebrew, right, that still centers on sacrifice, doesn't much change than what was in the Silverman. The Silverman put its meditation on the top of the page that we just read. And if you look over on the left-hand side, which I don't know, Becca, if you can squeeze over, where it says a meditation, Robert Gordos, basically they updated the language. They updated the language and, made it a little more modern. Actually, they changed it to brought you your offerings each Shabbat. So they may have thought that the language was better the first time, David, as you had mentioned. And they changed the fact that Eretz Yisrael, that Israel is now in existence, but they made it a meditation on the left-hand side. They also, even on this page in the bottom left, which you can read in your Sidurim on Shabbat if you haven't, talk about a metaphoric understanding of sacrifices using William James, the sacrifice of the heart, the sacrifice of the inner ego. And they used the same acrostic, right, that was basically used. Let's go to the next page, right? So what they updated was, of course, one of the hallmarks of Lev Shalem, of having the understanding of the liturgy on the right-hand side, literally what the words mean, and then kavanot and meditations and spiritual things to consider that are on the left side of the page. That in and of itself is an intent, a strong intent on how we're hoping people would have received Lev Shalem, and the same applies with Machzor Lev Shalem that we use on the holidays. So let's go to the next one. The alternative one. Nope. That one. There. Okay. So first, even in this alternative version, which tends to be the one that I tell people to continue quietly with, although we have lots of people that do the regular repetition, just as we have people that come to shul that have interlineal sidurim so that they can understand it or use the art scroll because they enjoy that interpretation and don't feel the need or can reinterpret it on their own as far as the liturgy as they're praying the different prayers. And all of that, ultimately, the conservative movement, by creating Lev Shalem and the commentaries and different alternatives, fall within the rubric of whatever people are comfortable with in the prayer. What I do want to point out here is just on the fourth line down in the Hebrew, we've gone from Taf to Aleph, and then good. If you would use use that, and this is a feature of some of the versions of Tekanta. The one necessarily in Art Scroll or the one that was in Silverman aren't the only versions that we have, since this was a medieval piyut. So after they go from Taf to Aleph, right, reverse acrostic, they say, Az mitzinai nita sis pedut lanu olamecha. And I think this is very clever, especially in those that do. After doing the acrostic, if you look at that second word, you have a mem, the second word of the fourth line. You have a mem, and then the next word you have a nun, and the next word starts with a tzadi, and the next word starts with a pei, and then the very end of the last word is chaf. What do those 5 letters have in common? Anybody? Well, the last word should give it away in this case. Those are the 5 words that when they're written at the end of a word have a separate letter. Just a little thing you may never have noticed, right? Now, in this one that we often read, sometimes we read it in English, and this kind of language appeared in Sidur Sim Shalom in the Masorti Sidur, as it says in the top of the page, of universal redemption rather than restoration. It emphasizes Shabbat in a sense. You can look at it, but it should sound or look familiar to you, since I bring it each time, being grateful to be planted in our land, in our borders, walking together by the light of your countenance, living lives of righteousness and justice and love and compassion and peace in the world. So it is a reinterpretation of the Musaf service and the idea of Korban and being close to God. And let me add that the far left-hand side, the Shabbat meditation. So this happens to be one of my favorite kavanot. Before I daven the Musaf service each and every week, I say this kavanah from Rabbi Ed Feld, who was the poetic expert and creative genius behind a lot of the poetry of Sidur Lev Shalem. So I would encourage you, when the time comes, to take a look at it. Okay, so let's take everything off the screen. Any reactions, right? Any reactions to what we've seen as far as the studying of the different kinds, right? We know, for example, that we saw Ben Zion Boxer, and we didn't read his paragraph completely, but he explores how sacrifice can function as a metaphor, which we know, for different expressions of devotion to God, including prayer, right? So how can, in your opinion, the ideas of sacrifice or priestly service that we find in the Tanakh, how can they enhance our spiritual lives? Anyone? Well, what does it mean to you if you think of prayer as an offering, to use that language, or as a gift to God, or even according to its meaning, korban, becoming close, karov, to God? Nobody? I see some heads nodding, but remember, our discussion has been, do we remove? Do we reframe? Do we completely reinterpret? Are all three legitimate?
I think the efforts the conservative movement make to make the Musaf prayer more relevant by adding the alternative and such are laudable. For me, they're not enough. I've even, to go back to what Henry said, I've even come to grips with the middle paragraph recently, thanks to Rachel Glazer, actually, and her reading of it, which I found very inspiring. But Musaf, and especially on Zoom and being home, it's almost impossible for me to do the Musaf Amida. It's just very difficult for me to relate to it.
Okay. Someone want to share an opposite view?
Are we unmuted? Okay, to me, it's a question of when you think there's a slippery slope. And some people think that if you compromise on anything, there's a slippery slope and eventually the Jewish people are going to disappear. I don't think so. And I can really live with these other interpretations. So it's all, in my mind, where you think changes become a slippery slope. I understand why from decades ago you felt like if you gave up anything, you would give up everything, but I don't think we're there anymore as a race. I mean, so yeah, that's a different viewpoint.
Okay. And you notice, by the way, that at Beth Israel, I think that there is value, great value in reinterpreting what the Musaf can mean. And that's why I generally steer people towards the alternative version of the Musaf service, and the same especially on Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot. And yet at the same time, sometimes on the altar, no sacrificial pun intended, on the altar of learning, a few times a year we have, as we did last week, the NNN Shabbat. And we went ahead and skipped the Musaf service. But I do remember coming into Beth Israel many years ago and hearing how there was a really long sisterhood, maybe the first bar bat mitzvah of a bat mitzvah. There were no men at the time, of women. And my predecessor decided to skip Musaf service and received holy hell from a lot of people in the congregation for doing so.
He actually said you can do it on your own. He didn't quite skip it, but you're right.
Well, you know,
there were people who were very upset with him.
Correct. And what's been interesting about the pandemic is the extent to which some Orthodox congregations have said, we're going to start with the Torah service and you should daven Shacharit on your own, or you should daven, you know, Psukei de Zimra and Birkot HaShachar. So a person that studies liturgy and really studies historically the development of liturgy, if you were to see the Sidurim, the early Sidurim of Chai Gaon or Sa'adja, 9th and 10th centuries, you might not necessarily recognize most of the prayers. It's one of the great things about the Sidur. I think personally that the conservative movement has given a lot of options for people that do want the traditional prayer, people that want an alternative total reframing of it without eliminating and cutting it out, adding the historical commentary and the kavanot. And there's always that broader question, Howard, about, you know, is there a matbea tefillah? Is there a form of liturgy that represents a traditional synagogue, right? That's a sort of middle of the road between tradition and change. And those are the kinds of things. I have to say that in the rabbinic era, now we talk about, you know, the Mishnah and the Talmud, sacrifice, as we know, served as a ritual paradigm, not just for prayer, but also for new practices, right? So I would bet that if there are those here tonight who are uncomfortable with the language of sacrifices in prayer, you still may participate in rituals that evoke temple service, because that's what the Musaf is all about, right? So if anybody was saying, I can't relate to that, the Musaf service prayer, it's hard for me even korban and offering, right? But in what ways do many of you in your home, right? What ways do you really do ritual things that have to do with temple service?
Friday night.
What do you do?
Well, first of all, the table is supposed to be a holy situation.
Okay, so the table was, you know, we went from the Beit HaMikdash to a Mikdash Me'at, a holy home. And what do we do that sort of gives us that symbolism?
The ritual we go through.
Okay, we wash our hands like the Kohanim did. We eat challah. We salt. Some people salt their challah. Right. What other vestiges of the korban, of sacrifices, do some synagogues still have, or did we grow up with?
Would lighting candles have anything to do with it because it's a fire, like the sacrifice of the fire?
I mean, yes, because it's the light of fire. It isn't exactly a ner tamid that existed before. All right, but what else? There are ones that are very specific. Most of you know them.
Make kiddush, we make mochi.
No, well, it doesn't have to be Friday night. what vestiges of the korbanot and priestly service do we still do and probably not think much of? Some people do and not think much of. Anybody here a Kohen or a Levi?
No.
Okay. If you're a Kohen or a Levi, most people come up and you ask them their name and they say, Yaakov ben Yosef HaKohen, or ben, Yosef HaLevi. We still use that we're a Kohen or a Levi, even though we don't, but many synagogues still give the first aliyah to a Kohen and the second aliyah to a Levi. So those were ways of, even though sacrifice was no longer extant, reinterpreting and giving meaning to Kohanim and Leviim, that interestingly enough, at the one hand, we object sometimes to the Musaf service and the language of sacrifice and to reinterpreting it. And yet, if I said to someone, let's not call anybody up by Kohen or Levi anymore, because it's reminiscent of the sacrifices in the temple, we would probably say that. What else about a Kohen? What else?
In what respect? I mean, he's got a lot of limitations.
Right. Kohen still traditionally has limitations.
Can't go to a cemetery.
And some of them can't go to the cemetery. And some of them follow that, even though ironically, they follow it because they don't want the impurity of a dead body, but we know that we're all impure, at least as far as Kohanim were concerned, right?
The Sukkot service when we march around with the lulav is reminiscent of the temple service.
Correct. It is, but it wasn't. So that's connected with the sacrifices, and we've continued to do that as a reminder of how we walked around the altar. So the fact is, Jewish tradition reinterpreted always. Even the rabbis reinterpreted, right? Because if I said to you, right, why do we daven Shachrit and Mincha and Maariv, and then of course the special Musaf on Shabbat? The answer based on what we studied tonight would be what? Because they were, yeah, Henry?
As it was a carryover of what was that we're still doing.
Right, because they were sacrifices. So since we switched avodah to mean the sacrifices themselves, we switched to avodat halev, right, the prayers of the heart. And so we have sacrifices that existed in the temple, and the sacrifices were called the Shachrit sacrifice, the Mincha sacrifice, the evening Maariv sacrifice, and on Shabbat and holidays, the Musaf sacrifice. So there was a continuity, if not in practice, the continuity of Odat Shabalev. I would call that a significant reframing and redefining of what the Musaf was, even if the prayers were still included literally in it. But what did the rabbis do? What did the rabbis do besides that? What in other ways did they reinterpret it? Anybody? Well, they did what any good lawyer would want to do if arguing before a court. Because if you want to argue for the validity of a practice, your best argument is that it's found in the
Torah.
Well, no, but a lawyer.
In the law books.
In the Constitution.
Yeah.
It's much better. If it's a local law, it's not as good as if it's a state law or a federal law. But if it's in the Constitution, then it's fine. And our Constitution, of course, is, Henry, as you just said, the Torah. So better than just saying we're mimicking the sacrifices in the temple, which doesn't say anything about prayer, even though it uses avodah and korbanot. It would be much better if we could find that the reason that we observe Shachrit, Mincha, and Maariv is not as much to do with sacrifices as it was something in the Torah. So with that, I'm sure that many of you may remember the explanation. Why is Shacharit connected to Abraham? Anyone?
Sacrifice Yitzchak.
Yes, very good. Related to sacrifice, right? God tells Abraham to sacrifice Yitzchak. And it says, Vayishkem Avraham baboker, that Abraham got up early in the morning to go sacrifice. So there's that lovely, sentence from the Torah where they said it was actually, it's, prayer, which is what the rabbis wanted to supersede when the temple was destroyed. Prayer is just as authentic, and forget about what's in the Torah. We can trace it all the way back to Abraham. Okay, what about mincha? Mincha was associated with Yitzchak, with Isaac. So what about mincha?
The meal where he purchased the birthright. Is that it?
Okay, I mean, I guess, we don't know if that was afternoon or evening, but that's a good guess. I'll give you a hint. It also has to do with a custom before a wedding.
Oh, the veil.
Veiling the bride?
The veiling of the bride. Well, the veiling of the bride comes in the Torah because it says that Isaac was meditating in the field in the afternoon. It literally almost, he was meditating in the field in the afternoon. And as he was going to meet Rivkah, and that she veiled herself. So that's where Bedekin comes from, but it also talks about him meditating in the field in the afternoon. All right. And of course, Mariv comes from Yaakov, from Jacob. So why would Mariv, which by the way was considered to be an optional service, is obligatory now, but was argued by the rabbis. What about Mariv?
Built the altar.
Why Jacob? What? I didn't see. Howard Burkham?
He built the altar after he had the dream, which was
his dream of wrestling with the angel was in the evening, right? God was in this place, and I did not know. So even the rabbis felt the need to reinterpret, obviously, when they went from sacrifice to prayer, but even reinterpret the need for prayer 3 times a day to be less tied to sacrifice, but tied to historical events, tied back to the Torah. And that concept that we've talked about and we'll end with of tradition and change, and we'll be talking about authority within Judaism and the patriarchy and all of that in 2 weeks, because next Sunday, a week from Sunday, will be our Tikkun Leil Shavuot in the community. And I'll actually be covering, although only in 45 minutes, one of these, but without watching the video, because there isn't, which is a little more of a theology about God and God of law versus God of love, and the differences in Christianity and in Judaism and our vision of that. But tonight we learned a little bit about how the conservative movement ultimately came to the Musaf that we all come to, with our choices of what to do, and the consideration of how we make prayer more relevant, or convince people that the Siddur can bring them in whatever path they choose of reading the Kavanot on the left or literally interpreting it in the traditional one, can bring them to their own personal spiritual understanding of their avodat halev, how they come to God, or their offerings, as the Silverman Siddur said it. So thank you, everybody. And
thank you.
I'll see you on this
Thank you,
class
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
weeks. And register for first day, for Yisker, because that's open. Spot still has a couple spots, but we're mostly filled for this week as we come back.
See a lot of you tomorrow night at tailgate.
Tomorrow night at tailgate, but be aware, just in case it's raining, there'll be a message. So call if it's raining. All right, take care, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you again, Rabbi. Yashkoach.
Yasher Koach.